afternoon and welcome. My name is Robin Williams. I'm from the University of Edinburgh and I'm chairing this event. Welcome to this virtual workshop on science, technology and innovation studies in a post-COVID-19 world. As you know, this event is organised by AsSIST-UK, the UK Association for Studies in Innovation, Science and Technology. The COVID pandemic interrupted our plans for a face-to-face conference this year, so we were very keen to find other ways to get together and continue our tradition of collegiate debate and engagement with the key challenges of contemporary life. So we reached out to our members and to colleagues and friends and found that SIST colleagues all over the place are very active, both in reflecting on current responses to the COVID pandemic, but also in looking forward to the transition into a post-COVID world. So we quickly assembled a strong panel of speakers addressing different dimensions and contexts. We have a very full programme and it's going to be very rushed. We'll start with a few points of housekeeping. The mechanics of doing a Zoom webinar like this are surprisingly complex, and we're all learning how to work together in this online environment. We've got 2 blocks of presentations followed by a Q&A session, and we're inviting participants to use the Q&A buttons to pose questions and comments. And it would be helpful if you could indicate if these are directed towards a particular speaker. As the Q&A time is limited, our moderators, Barbara Ribeiro and Matjas Vidmar, will be pulling out and combining some of the key questions for the speakers to respond to. And we plan to publish all the posts in the conference report. The meeting is going to be recorded, partly for us to produce a report, but also we're going to make it available online and the presentations, and the speakers have kindly agreed to this. Participants won't be identified except in their Q&A posts, and Q&A posts can be anonymous if you want them to. So we only have 90 minutes. There's going to be a short break in the middle, and speakers will therefore need to stick very strictly to time limits, and we'll be alerting them when they're coming to the end of their time slot with a little ping 2 minutes from the end, and again when they need to stop. So our first session addresses the broad theme of entanglements and responses to pandemics. And we have 3 presentations followed by a Q&A session, ending around 5 to 3. Now we've got brief biographies of our speakers on the web. So to save time, I'm not going to do a long presentation, but I'll certainly invite speakers in turn. So can I first welcome Eva Giraud from Keele University to kick off discussions this afternoon with her presentation, After the Age of Wreckers and Exterminators. Eva, over to you.
Thanks. I'll just try and share my screen. Is that shared? Okay. Yeah, okay, perfect. So this is, oh, wrong slide. In mid-May, ex-Labour Prime Minister Gordon Brown declared that coronavirus needed to be, quote, eradicated on every continent. And he's certainly not been alone in this framing. The discourse of eradication and extermination is, moreover, not novel to coronavirus, but has a far longer history in relation to prior technoscientific initiatives that have sought to create distance between humans and other beings, particularly beings that are deemed harmful, or in some instances, as I'll talk about today, also those that are deemed just a bit annoying in some contexts. For instance, drawing on the work of Lewis Mumford, David Kinkeller's history of DDT of the mid-20th century, the quote, age of wreckers and exterminators. And this term is used to describe the rise of large-scale public health infrastructures that sought to create distance between humans and other harmful life forms, in part through chemically enforced programs of eradication, although not entirely. So Kinkeller's book focuses on mosquitoes. DDT has also been used to eradicate other beings, most notably bed bugs, which is something Greg, Colin and I have written about. And these bugs were almost, in fact, nearly extirpated from North America and Western Europe before their recent resurgence. Now, I'm not going to talk about coronavirus per se as much as how these broader narratives of wrecking and exterminating might kind of be ways of thinking about the kind of ethical tensions that are surrounding the present moment. And I'm going to be kind of fairly broad brush about things due to time. I did want to note though that these general reflections came from previous work I've done both individually and with colleagues. Last year I published a book that was working with, but also sort of sympathetically against, in some ways, a body of theory that's gained a lot of purchase in STS and other disciplines, such as the environmental humanities, which has centralised entanglements between humans and non-humans as a kind of site of ethical potential. These entanglements are often seen in positive terms, as giving rise to maybe less anthropocentric ways of conceiving of, and also hopefully of acting in the world. But what I kind of was trying to argue in the book was that sometimes these approaches don't give much purchase on questions about how to intervene in entangled relationships with other beings that could be harmful, sometimes to people, but often also to the other beings in question. And in particular, there was a tendency to sort of label more problematic relationships as reflective of the fact that everything's non-innocent, without necessarily giving a sense of how to kind of choose between different non-innocent possibilities and what the ethical state and inequalities attached to some of those relationships are. So what I was trying to explore in this book, by drawing in particular on activist interventions, were what happens when questions about the states of disentanglement, distance and separation are centralised as ways of thinking. And I'm going to talk about that a bit more specifically now by turning to just a couple of points raised in this second piece that was out last year, which I wrote with colleagues Eleanor Hadley-Kershaw, Richard Helliwell and Gregory Holland, who's kind of stood over there, which was called Abundance in the Anthropocene. And this piece, I think, speaks in more specific ways to contemporary moment. And so it's the two key points that we made in this paper that I wanted to touch on today. In a nutshell, the article argues that a lot of emphasis has rightfully been on the present moment as one of overwhelming species loss. What we argued in the paper was a need to reflect on the flip side of this problem too. Challenges that are posed by species that have grown abundant at the same time as others have declined, and in some instances, species that have kind of exacerbated the decline of other beings. In the paper, we contrasted the very different relationships and ethical questions posed by entanglements between certain groups of humans and three life forms in particular: bedbugs, AMR, and hookworms. And we highlighted two issues in particular that I think could perhaps speak to other debates about dealing with abundance in the contemporary moment. Our first point was that 50 years after wrecking and exterminating was at its heyday, a range of social and technological factors mean that this logic is often no longer an option. In the wake of cultural phenomena such as Silent Spring, for instance, DDT is obviously a no-go for eradicating bedbugs, but there's also been a resistance to the more kind of, or I suppose the less harmful chemicals that do exist today. The problems of AMR, of course, have been well documented in science studies. Hookworms offer slightly more complicated provocations because while they remain pathological in certain regions, in others, it's the lack of hookworms that's been seen as a problem. And there's been a development of helminthic therapies in response to a range of autoimmune conditions. So in very different ways, therefore, these cases suggest that one of the challenges of the contemporary moment is finding ways to negotiate what Joanna Latimer calls being alongside life forms that are impossible to disentangle with human worlds, but also equally impossible in some contexts to live with, especially for communities who are already facing poverty, discrimination and violence. And this leads to the second point we made in the paper, that it's also insufficient to simply just underline the inevitability of being entangled with other life forms, as this can obscure some more difficult questions about how to sort of think about rearticulating in these relationships in less harmful ways. Across all of these cases, questions about who can choose to be entangled with particular life forms, who can opt out, and how harmful these entanglements might be, are tightly bound with socioeconomic relations. In the case of bedbugs, for instance, narratives of resurgence and reappearance that exist often point to the insects bouncing back after their near extirpation. But this simply kind of almost erases the fact that in a lot of parts of the world, bedbugs have never disappeared. Even with their resurgence in the UK and US, for instance, the narrative is sometimes that bedbugs are a leveller that, as Lisa Saracen puts it, cut the wealthy down to size. But this can sometimes also neglect questions about it being easier for some people to remove bed bugs than others, and also about the stigma that comes attached with these types of infestations that are often explicitly classed and racialised. And Heather Lynch has got some really fascinating ethnographic work about their resurgence in areas of Glasgow that speaks to this point. In the article, we also talk about similar inequalities that are imbricated with AMR and hookworms. Richard, for instance, details how refugees are especially at risk of the dangers of AMR, and the development and spread of resistance is further entangled with longer histories of colonialism and Western military intervention. Similarly, if we look at hookworms again as an example, there are clear socioeconomic factors related to how dangerous these parasites can be. They were eliminated in the southern US for economic reasons primarily, where they would, as Eleanor puts it, the germ of laziness and seem to hamper economic productivity, which was a key driver for their elimination. But they've remained a problem in tropical and subtropical regions. So these cases, therefore, what we were trying to do in comparing the different forms of entanglement and the dangers associated with them pose really different challenges about the impossibility of disentanglement from harmful life. On the one hand, there's a need to move beyond a straightforward language of eradication, to find ways of living alongside beings that are increasingly difficult to expunge from human worlds. But at the same time, it's important to recognise and centralise the uneven stakes of these developments and questions about who might be forced to live alongside these forms of harmful lives and who gets a chance to opt out. And these 2 points seem equally significant to recent events, underlining a need not just to move beyond wrecking and exterminating and eradicating narratives, but questioning how to grapple with a context where this is often not a possibility that's even open. Holding these issues in view seems particularly important in the wake of a diametrically opposing narrative that's also emerged in recent weeks, that kind of re-articulated the language of wrecking and exterminating to slightly different ends. Rather than suggesting that dangerous life needs to be eradicated, instead it's often humans who are being positioned as kind of the threat for being the wreckers. This is obviously a kind of parody of this type of narrative, I'd just like to point out. This is kind of broad narrative of nature's resurgence in the wake of coronavirus. As Adam Searle and Johnny Turnbull trace in a recent piece for Dialogues in Human Geography, for instance, events related to COVID-19 have been opportunistically leveraged in support of environmental and animal activist agendas, as creating space for rethinking relationships with the so-called natural world. So in certain contexts, these narratives can be engaged with sensitively and pose important questions. All too often, this isn't the case. Discourses of humans as being the virus, being the wreckers, being the exterminators are commonplace, as are, of course, a number of ethnocentric tropes related to wet markets, for instance. So in these contexts, thinking beyond either an uncritical celebration of being entangled with other beings and recognising that disentanglement, at the same time as recognising that disentanglement is a difficult task and maybe no longer possible in some instances, seems to require a much more sustained reflection on the specific ways that distance and detachment can be fostered in context-specific manners that extend agency to those most affected by the issues at stake. And that's, thank you very much. Hopefully that was in time. I think you're on mute still, Robin.
Robin is mute.
Sorry, thanks very much. Very nice introduction to today's talk. And because time is so short, we're going to push straight on to the next speaker and have the discussion at the end. So I'm happy to welcome Michael Schulmeier from University of Exeter, whose presentation has the intriguingly cryptic title of Counter-Stroke Infections. Over to you, Michael.
Thanks a lot. I will also put my slides on just in a sec. So can everybody see my slides? Yes. Okay, so I think my paper nicely links to Eva's paper. So there's a kind of discourse that I will also intend to do as Eva did. The picture is a painting, as you can see, someone wearing a mask. It is done by a disabled person, so I really enjoyed, and I will talk a bit about disabled people in coronavirus situation as well. The paper I will present today is a short version of a paper that will just be published in Space and Culture. We also did a special issue that also will be published now on quarantine spaces in COVID situations. Okay, so I was quite, I thought it was quite brave to call the title of our session about some reflection of a post-COVID world. It seems to me that the post-COVID world is the pre-COVID world. So we are facing not the end of a COVID world, but maybe we face another COVID world that is just lingering around the corner. Maybe we could talk about it even in a dramatize the issue by talking about post-progressive societies. And I will just mention a few certainties. There's quite a bit of talk about uncertainties, but I think there are also quite a few certainties that come with the COVID-19 situation. First of all, I think we knew since many years that a coronavirus pandemic will occur. So we know since 2003 latest that there will be a new pandemic coronavirus coming. We didn't know when, but we know that it will occur. The second certainty, I think, is that the vulnerable or the disadvantaged people will become more vulnerable, will become more disadvantaged. So just to give you an example from today, we just had in Germany in a slaughterhouse 650 new positive tested COVID people. Those are migrants, cheap labor forces that work in a slaughterhouse. And I just give you a very disturbing number. Next to the 650 people who have been infected, this slaughterhouse produces kills 46,000 pigs a day. This sums up to 70 million pigs a year. And this is just one company. Another certainty, I think, is that many countries, if not all, were badly prepared. And this is quite interesting because, for example, since Georg Simmel 1911, he already talked about the preparedness as being much more cheaper for the industry than being not prepared. And it's quite interesting to see why people are still so badly prepared for those kind of things. Another certainty, I think, is that some countries are dealing with the pandemic better than others. We may also think why this is the case. So when I was thinking about the coronavirus that happened now, I already have worked on the first corona epidemic in 2003, the SARS epidemic. And I think one can describe this situation as a cosmopolitical event, as I call them. So what this is that a non-human actor somehow unbuttons the cosmos of what we take for granted as social relations and practices. So my main question is, and always has been, and is reinforced by the COVID-19 situation, how to understand the social and how to understand the societal. And I like to invite you to think with me along the lines of a question of how can we think, or if we can think the social as a process of infection and counter-infection. Can we think the societal as something different, but linked to the social as very specific orderings of those counter-infections? So linking to what Eva just said, one could say, well, the COVID-19 experience, first of all, shows us that we are earthlings on the one hand, so that we are part of a living system, but also that we are worldlings. So this makes us different. This is, the world is where we create our own world through extension, through technologies, and so forth. So on the one hand, like all living societies, human and viruses, no, I'm fine. Like all living societies, humans and viruses are thieves. So they are robbers. In order for us to live, we have to take something from the environment in order to live. Otherwise, we won't be able to live. So we share with viruses that we are robbers. Like humans, viruses are clever and resistant social agents, and they have high capabilities to adapt and change. And this is one of the problems of viruses and bacteria and all those kind of agents. They are very similar here to with the human agency. Like humans, viruses enjoy mobility, interaction, and networking. So they like to be in groups, they like to create societies, they like to suck from others in order to become stable. So that's why I think we also have something in common here. So we have to accept that viruses desire socializing and collectivizing as much as we humans do. So we share with them that we want to be, that we are social beings and that we like societal organization, although in highly different ways. So if we take this idea of robbery, of environmental robbery as a specific sign of living societies serious, then and this is what Whitehead already said at the very beginning of last century, that this robbery requires justification whenever this robbery appears. So whenever living societies are alive, what they do needs justification. And this is a question that can be raised and links now to the issue I made at the beginning with the situation of those cheap labor forces, of the environmental robbery. So we could say that the COVID-19 adds to the urgent request of the Anthropocene to put the question of justification of environmental robbery in all its form on the agenda of responsible global human politics and everyday action and interaction. So the question of infection and counter-infection is a question of values, how we actually deal and infect values in order to live well with others.
That's fantastic, and fantastic timekeeping. Thank you very much, Michael. And our final speaker this afternoon, Annie Wilkinson from IDS in Sussex, is going to talk about social science in epidemic response, engaging with social dimensions. Annie, over to you.
Hi, I think Michael needs to stop sharing before I can share.
I think I already stopped.
Oh, maybe let me try again. It was telling me. Ah, now yes, I can.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, hi. Yes, so I'm going to talk about this expanding field of social science in epidemic response, and about some of the work really that myself and colleagues at IDS and partners all over the world have been doing to try and build and strengthen this applied social science field. The first point I want to make, which is probably basic for this audience, is that epidemics are social phenomena. So take any disease and there'll be any number of kind of social dimensions. I've got Ebola and COVID-19 here. So taking Ebola, that, you know, they spread through and because of the social fabric. So Ebola in particular affected people who cared properly for the sick and the dead in West Africa. It affected healers and doctors who were some of the most respected people. COVID-19 doesn't transmit in such a kind of uniquely intimate way as the kind of bodily fluids, but it does spread through caregiving and also other forms of more casual contact. But we see that there are also very unequal vulnerabilities to COVID-19. So there are, you know, existing inequalities affect how people are exposed and also how bad the outcomes are. the control recommendations to stop diseases could often be seen as being antisocial. So this was really apparent with Ebola again. People were told not to touch, not to bury people in traditional kind of ways. They were forced sometimes to cremate, told to send the ill to isolation wards, which were managed by strangers. And where you have kind of local models of care, and this is not just West Africa, this is anywhere in the world, local models of care and burial, which are linked to ideas about the afterlife and about forms of kind of social reproduction. Control measures which interfere with these are perceived sometimes as a threat to kind of continuity of life. And then there's also all sorts of other practical concerns, for example, livelihoods and harvest, like farming and the rice harvest. With COVID-19, we see that control measures, again, they relate to how we show our love and our care, whether it's to grandparents, parents, wider society, and that we have to resist instincts to be together. And then, of course, there is, as we are all seeing, devastating economic and social impacts, and again, unevenly distributed. The other thing is that responses have social and political lives. So in West Africa, the kind of interpretations of what kind of government elites or outsiders, kind of white foreign NGOs were doing, there was a huge amount of distrust, which was rooted in historical and contemporary forms of experiences of kind of resource extraction, including slavery and abuses of power. And then control measures for COVID-19, it's hard to kind of summarize what the social and political lives of COVID-19 control measures, but take, for example, we do know that they have been used to kind of enforce and extend power, crack down on minorities, and kind of further marginalized populations. The other thing to say, though, is that a big part of the kind of social phenomena of epidemics is that people and societies will and do change, and they adapt. So you have got very varied social, political, and economic contexts. But then each disease and each context will interact in complex and unpredictable ways. But I think what we also need to kind of remember and emphasize when thinking about the social dimensions of epidemics is also that the response has a culture. And so this is not a comprehensive list, but just some of the ways. So they frame a disease in a certain way. So it might be placing the blame on there's often a blame kind of culture, but placing the kind of emphasis on individual or collective responsibility. In the example of COVID, is it seen to be just another, like a flu, or is it a completely new multi-system disease with long-term effects? Another big question is whose knowledge counts and dominates. So often there's a kind of dynamic of, is it external, and this is more relevant for Ebola, I think, than and other kind of outbreaks and maybe COVID, but external experts or local knowledge. Actually, it's not more relevant for COVID, but then, and then there's also disciplinary kind of hierarchies. So often traditionally kind of epidemic responses have really been dominated by biomedical knowledge, and increasingly epidemiological modeling as a form of that, to the exclusion of kind of social science evidence and social science knowledge. There's a tendency often for standardized protocols and one-size-fits-all approaches. There is this kind of often emergency thinking, so things are done very fast. Often, there's this idea that you need to that it ends up being kind of vertical or parallel interventions, which often undermine or overlook existing systems and existing and pre-existing kind of priorities or challenges. A big question, I think, is also how does the response learn? So responses also adapt. Well, some of them do, but that's a question. How inflexible are they? Do they tend towards kind of being inflexible, or do they manage to be adaptive? So I think West Africa, though, was a turning point, both for response institutions, by which I mean, the World Health Organization, organizations like UNICEF, but also for the social science community. And if you remember back during the West African outbreak, there was, the response strategies were really, at the beginning at least, really backfiring. There was riots, there was uncontrolled spread, there was huge amounts of resistance. And this was really because these social dimensions, social and political dimensions, were being overlooked or not considered. So we at IDS and many other institutions set up something called the Ebola Response Anthropology Platform, which is the icon on the left, which was really to kind of a network, to bring together networks of anthropologists who had begun to organize and to try and kind of inform and influence the response, partly to try and kind of address some of those issues that I referred to. And so they began to kind of shape policy. And so whether it was the development of community-based care centres, or changing the burials policy, or advocating things about kind of advice about home care, which was deemed to be kind of unacceptable initially. And there have, since the Ebola Anthropology Platform and the Ebola epidemic, there has been actually a really big kind of expanded field of social science. And so there's a number of new initiatives. So the black icon at the kind of bottom is what something called the Social Science Humanitarian Action Platform, which we have set up, which is the kind of the thing that followed on from the Ebola Response Platform and works in a similar way. But there's other initiatives. For example, there's an EU-funded network, Sonar Global, which focuses a lot on kind of capacity building. So yeah, this is a growing field. And I just wanted to briefly end with giving a little, just to explain some of the ways in which we have been trying to integrate social science into the responses. So the first thing to mention, though, is that this is building on a history of particularly anthropological engagement in health emergencies. So organizations like the WHO did have people normally kind of, they did involve, it was quite small scale. So they would have like an anthropologist going out with a field investigation team to kind of investigate an outbreak, but they didn't really have any kind of, they didn't really think about kind of mix of disciplines or kind of having, social science or other informing kind of policy at a high level. And then of course, there's been lots of kind of academic work on public health and on epidemics, but it hasn't had this kind of operational focus. So the platform model, which really is about building networks of social scientists to provide rapid operational insights into contextual or outbreak dynamics. So that's people that have subject or regional expertise. They might not necessarily, normally be the people that would volunteer to get involved, but they have all of this valuable knowledge, often from kind of long-term research projects and engagements. And in the case of anthropology, sometimes from quite slow subjects, not used to being kind of rapid. But yeah, so it's about kind of trying to broach those two worlds and mobilize that knowledge and expertise. So what we have been doing is, building these networks, and then mobilizing that knowledge in the form of kind of briefings, evidence syntheses, just providing advice, sometimes doing kind of collection and analysis of community feedback during an outbreak. And we've had quite a lot of quite, I guess, high level engagement. So for the West African Ebola outbreak, we fed into SAGE, not for the COVID one. And shaped things like community care centres, burial practices, burial policies. And for COVID-19, colleagues of mine have been involved in the WHO Science Committee, have informed various kind of international guidelines. And this has really been the result of a lot of advocacy and fundraising. This wasn't easy. I'd say it's now, there is this growing kind of field and there is a number of initiatives, but it took the proof of concept, I guess, from West Africa. It took lots of people said, yes, this is great, we definitely need to do this. And then it took a long time for actual kind of commitments to come on board. But yeah, I think there now is a growing community of theory and practice of kind of academics and operational communities that have this shared understanding about kind of health emergencies. And hopefully are having some impact on the way that epidemics, whether it's kind of Zika, Ebola, or even COVID-19 are playing out in different settings. That's it.
That's fantastic. Okay, 3 fantastic presentations. Now I have to say, I'm very disappointed with the audience here because we were expecting, we have a whole machinery set up to digest a flood of posts and we haven't had any. So I'm inviting you to start your comments and questions now. But the first question I can pose to Annie Wilkinson And C. Bellat, I don't know who that actually stands for, says, why are non-human animals absent from your presentation? What do you think introducing them could bring to your reflection on the sociology of epidemics and epidemic responses? And that, interestingly, of course, echoes some of the points that Eva made in the opening talk. So Annie, can you respond to that question?
Non-human animals. Well, I think, I mean, they might have been absent from my presentation because I was having to be very quick. But a lot of the work that we have done has actually been on kind of zoonotic diseases. And so understanding human and non-human animal interactions and how and why spillovers occur has formed a really big part of the work that we have done. Yeah, both in understand, and that I guess feeds more into the kind of preparedness side of things and understanding what really are the kind of drivers of disease in different areas. And then the other thing is to try and, what we have also done a lot of is kind of critiquing some of the more facile and oversimplistic understandings of spillover. So again, with Ebola and a bit with COVID-19, wet markets or bushmeat trades or things like that were actually, so for example, in the Ebola epidemic, all the advice about bushmeat was actually really misleading and caused further distrust because people were saying, well, we've eaten bushmeat for a long time and we've lived with bats and all sorts of wildlife for a long time. Anyway, so it wasn't in the presentation, but it is in our work.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because the reality suggests that human agricultural practices are changing distributions of bats, and that's changing the propensity of viruses to move between species. Very complex sets of interactions have been foregrounded. Yeah. There's another question from Andrew to the panel, and maybe we won't get all of them to ask, but it's a question about, do the different forms of socio-technical barriers to entanglement, vaccines, masks, distancing, quarantine, do they assume different spatial and temporal controls? And are these aligned or in tension? Is there a tension between our different control measures? Anyone want to take up? If any of our panelists want to take up that, they should switch on their microphones and answer.
I mean, I think there are tensions. I mean, let's take the lockdown that has been imposed by governments. On the one hand, you could say this is a counter-infection, as I would say, to counter the infection of the virus with same tools to somehow introduce pathological norms so that limit your life, although with the sake of trying to survive, but it is a way of actually limiting how you are able to live. So that's why people got a bit so annoyed, and this kind of corona rebels, they try to fight against exactly those kind of imposition of norms, of pathological norms that come through those kind of ways of dealing with a so important and dangerous mode of infection like COVID-19.
Annie, did you have any thoughts on that? It was possibly quite close to the kind of things you were flagging as well.
Can you repeat the question exactly?
It's that there are different kinds of barriers and attempts to reverse entanglements between viruses and humans, like vaccines, masks, distancing and quarantine, and they have very different spatial and temporal features. And the question is, are they aligned or are they in tension?
I suppose I think it can be. It can be all of those things. I think there's never one thing that, the bringing about the end of an epidemic involves all sorts of different control measures on a number of different kind of fronts. I don't necessarily think, I don't think they have to be in tension. I think the main tensions do seem to come when you have these, vastly different kind of, for example, political or kind of economic perspectives that really are in tension. So whether it's the kind of freedom, the COVID kind of anti-lockdown, this kind of imagined tension between the economy or saving lives. I think it plays out in different ways. That's not a very good answer, but
that's good enough. I mean, it's interesting because thinking about Eva's introductory talk and the difficulties, we thought we were going to get rid of malaria with DDT, and that comes as a kind of magic bullet that reverses these entanglements. And I suppose in today's context, the equivalent thing is the vaccine. Yeah, and we all watched the film. What was the film which kind of almost seems to have described our situation in anticipation? I've forgotten. It was the Hollywood movie about 5 years ago, and everything was a disaster. And then suddenly the vaccine arrives, and then normal life can be returned. And it's a wonderful story. And I think some people that is some people's perception that will happen. Either that, or the virus will suddenly go away, and normal order will be restored as a result of herd immunity. Eva, I don't know is that something you're looking at?
Yeah, I mean, that paper emerged after, so Greg and I had been writing about bed bugs for a bit and did a presentation about that. And Richard, who was one of the co-authors on the abundance paper, I think he maybe was the person that said, well, he's been thinking about in relation to AMR, are there similar things going on in the sense of, but maybe with higher stakes? You know, bed bugs aren't disease vectors, they're annoying and they're painful, and, you know, and their resurgence might be irritating for all sorts of reasons. But AMR is, you know, the stakes are raised. And he was saying with the decline of so many infrastructures and drugs and chemicals and ways of creating separation, and with the sort of decline of those things, are we, in an overly broad sense perhaps, going to have to think of different ways of living with things that we were formerly able to sort of distance ourselves from? Is that going to become an impossibility? And what forms of politics and what sort of questions does that open up? And we were sort of that's what we were trying to get at in the paper, you know, what happens if we need to think through those questions of how to inhabit a world where it's just increasingly difficult to disentangle from things that are harmful.
That's an interesting point. Yeah. So we also have, if you think about, there are lots of people doing work on antimicrobial resistance and lots of biologists and medics. And if we say the idea that that viruses are adapting and our action is met with counteraction, would hardly surprise them. In a sense, it's almost it's something that biologists have picked up on, which our Anthropocene perspective has only latterly acknowledged. I suspect, you know, we're following the story rather than leading the story here. I don't know if you'd agree with that.
I think maybe the framing of some of the things. So one of the starting points we were looking at a lot of texts that have seen hope in things that have kind of, as Anna Singh might put it, like thrived in the capitalist ruins. So she was kind of looking at these mushrooms that have kind of emerged in ruined landscapes, and quite a few texts have sort of taken hope from things that have emerged in brownfield sites and things like that. And just the point we were making is that not all forms of abundance and entanglement are things to celebrate. Whether that's I'm not sure how I'd articulate that in relation to the sort of social sciences versus biology, but
okay, very good. So we have a post from Theo Papanayou. He asks, and I'm not sure who's posing it to, possibly Annie, but maybe any of our speakers could respond to this. How do you avoid having some types of knowledge dominating against other types of knowledge in the process of responding to emergencies? Are there norms emerging from the practice of responding to Ebola and other epidemics? Who's in disciplinary control?
I think it's an ongoing struggle, an issue, and I think it always will be. As I tried to say after Ebola, I do think Ebola was a bit of a turning point, and it did to more simple.
You've frozen. Is it just me, or has Annie just frozen? Would another member of the panel like to take up this question while we're waiting for Annie's connection to come back live again? about different forms of knowledge? I thought things were going rather too well on the internet front. Oh, anyhow, while we're waiting, Camille Bele, that's who had asked a question earlier, poses a question to Michael.
It looks like Annie's back.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know what happened. Everything just shut down.
Oh, you disappeared. Can you say it again?
So I think I was saying that, yeah, so there's been, I'd say, institutional changes within some of the key organizations like WHO, so creation of kind of social science kind of groups. There's often much more social science are kind of often involved, asked to be part of kind of these blueprint prioritization exercises. Some of it feels quite tokenistic, some of it feels more meaningful. For example, with the DRC Ebola response, there was kind of weekly social science kind of coordinating calls. That was at the kind of international level. There was also things like that happening at country level. So all of that is quite new, and it's quite different to the previous model, which was an anthropologist goes out and does kind of the investigation. I do think with social science, the one problem is that it's often conflated with essentially just community engagement and risk communication, which is, I think, a very limited understanding of what it can add. So there's definitely still power struggles. The other thing I think to mention is, particularly in our work, and this goes on with the decolonized movements that are happening, I think the kind of the northern, southern kind of expertise and who dominates there is really, really apparent and problematic, and something that needs to be challenged.
Very interesting. Okay, Camille Bele has a question to Michael Schulmeier and asks, are humans and viruses similar thieves, especially when thinking about the necessity of both to maintain their hosts to survive? Michael. Uh-oh. We've lost Michael. Des Fitzgerald poses a question. He thanks the panel for 3 great talks, and he asks if anyone wants to reply to this question. We should just gone off the page on my screen. STS as a body of knowledge and practice seems largely absent from mainstream public and political considerations of the present crisis. This despite the pandemic being rooted in exactly the kind of situations and tensions that STS scholars have spent decades producing knowledge about. How should we think about this? Why is STS marginalized? How do we respond to that? Anyone want to respond on this question? I mean,
it has been really striking, hasn't it? In terms of a lot of other sociological, not that there's anything wrong with this, but quite a lot of other sociological journals have been sort of putting forward ways of saying, right, we need to think about care, we need to think about things that I suppose are mainstays of maybe like STS or medical sociology in particular. And so it seems really interesting that there's this kind of wealth of expertise, I suppose, and knowledge that's been developed, you know, it's got a kind of real history in certain contexts that maybe hasn't been taken up. And all I can say is that I've really noticed the same thing. I'm obviously not a medical sociologist, I work in a media department, so I'm not the best person to speak to that. And there's probably people on this panel who noticed that more. But it does seem a real kind of curious, either absence or, yeah, I think it's dead on, but I'm not necessarily sure why that is.
I mean, it may not be so much of an absence, rather that the other disciplines have been very articulate in coming forward, and STS with his normal reflective reticence and saying quiet things gets left behind by others who have very loud voices and very confident positions. Look, we've come to the time when we're going to have a 5-minute break. I'm still inviting people on the line to post questions, and hopefully we'll bring them back in the final session. But we have a policy which is, we know that Zoom meetings are really tiring. So we have a policy, we're going to have a 5-minute break and we'll come back online at 5 to 3. Okay, so thanks for everybody for their very interesting contributions so far, and we'll see you again shortly, but we can switch off and calm down just a little while before we recommence our discussions. Okay, thanks very much.
Unfortunately, my system broke down a few times, so I did not hear all the conversations. I hope it will be a bit more stable now.
You have to close many applications in my experience.
I did close everything. It just chuck and it goes off. And
Okay, welcome back, everybody. I've just had time to make a cup of tea. I haven't had a chance to drink it yet, so apologies if you hear me slurping. The second block of talks is linked by a theme of control, expertise and uncertainties, and I'd like to invite Rainer Grundmann from Nottingham University to kick off with his contribution on COVID-19 science and expertise. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Can everyone see the slides? Okay. So I'll start with this picture, and many of you will remember when this started back in in March. 3 men there, still with people in the audience before the slogans were invented. So Prime Minister, Chief Medical Officer, Chief Science Advisor. Politics has center stage, right? So it's a highly symbolic setting to triumvirate the 3 people who are defining what knowledge counts and what decisions will be implemented. So I'm addressing this through, let me see, through a few frameworks, trying to understand what's going on, very much inspired by Rainey Dustin's notion of ground zero empiricism, which is to say that there are few things we know for certain. There are a lot of uncertainties about this COVID, and there is a temptation to apply existing frameworks blindly without re-examining them. So I want to do that with regard to the terms of civic epistemology, using its twin or sibling co-production to look at the UK case, and also making a distinction between science and expertise, which I've been arguing for quite a while, to say the two must not be confused. And then there is a very brief sort of thought about the notion of epistemological populism. So this is the question, has Boris Johnson really gone back inviting experts and taking them seriously, or is there still something else going on? So first of all, the notion of civic epistemology. This is largely associated, of course, with Sheila Jasanoff's work. And if you look at the UK, there is a specific way in which knowledge is made legitimate, and the decisions which are associated with that knowledge are seen as legitimate. And Jasanoff, in her typology, says the UK has an empiricist distrust of untested and overextended models, and even a residual skepticism towards all model-based predictions. So this is something we will need to re-examine, I suggest. In more general terms, what can be observed in the UK is that the government usually, after long silence, comes up with a plan, announces the plan. There is no public consultation. If the opposition or other groups in society make enough noise, there can be U-turns. That is the usual way of doing things. Never admit errors or engage in deep debates. Improvisation is the nature of the game, and a lot of cost-benefit analysis. The institutionalized system is the chief science advisor and specific committees, in this case, SAGE. The system is also closed and top-down, so this is something, you know, many of these points would be part of a civic epistemology a la Jasanoff, but probably not the first 2 that I mentioned there in italics, or maybe even the first 3. So let's have a look at how this has played out in the case of COVID and SAGE. So this is the co-production idiom, also known as the sausage factory. Often this term is attributed to Otto von Bismarck, but that's wrongly attributed. So you can see the reference if you are interested in. Anyway, what I want to show is the sort of ground zero situation in the sciences. On the left, you have a sort of screenshot of preprint papers on preprint archives, and you see there are about 5,000 published there. They are not peer-reviewed yet, but they are likely to hold a lot of important information. There are about 18,000 published articles according to the Web of Science, and there are about 50,000 according to Google Scholar. So this is the knowledge base. Now this goes into the SAGE group. We don't know what happens there. So we probably know more about sausage factories nowadays than about governmental decision-making. There is an emphasis on modeling and on behavioral sciences. That are two strongholds. These are two strongholds, and there is very little public health expertise. There is no sociology, as we just heard before. There is no STS. So there is even on it's a very, very narrow kind of expertise that's grouped there together. Then this, whatever knowledge comes out of that, and we don't know how that knowledge is absorbed or selected, probably goes through the CSA and the CMO to the government, and we don't know who is influential there. Is it the health secretary? Is it a kitchen cabinet with Boris Johnson calling the shots? So everyone says we are guided by the science, but we don't know exactly what the science base is. And we also hear things about gut feelings and common sense, especially by the Prime Minister. And then there are U-turns. So the most, of course, important one was imposing the lockdown after 2 weeks delay. And that was claimed to be science-based, but the author of the study, Neil Ferguson from Imperial, made clear, as was clear to everyone, that this wasn't really new information. So if you look at the SAGE papers, as far as I could ascertain, there is nothing in the paperwork that would indicate the scientists wanted an early lockdown and the government refused that and only later did that. So briefly, the difference between science and expertise. So when the government says we are guided by the science, that could mean three things, because it's a body of knowledge, institutions and individual scientists. And in this case, it is mainly modeling. So I'm putting that in very stark, maybe exaggerated terms, but it's not data, because data is inconvenient, at least in the UK. And there are lots of studies that find different things. So the science doesn't tell us what to do, put bluntly. Now, expertise is different, because experts will select this information, evaluate it, make judgments, and ultimately propose courses of action that lead to decisions. So not all experts are scientists, and they work for clients. Often advisory bodies are said they should be independent. SAGE is, of course, not independent. The majority of its members are civil servants. Now, if we apply that sort of distinction or the definition of experts to our case of COVID, experts do not need to be scientists. They do not need to have produced the knowledge themselves. So they will have selected information, made a judgment, and operate on specific values in order to define a policy. And what we have here with regard to COVID is two sort of ideal, typical scenarios which are in play in the UK. We could probably produce many more shades of grey in between. The first one would be that COVID cannot be contained. That is something that SAGE believed strongly from the beginning. There was an assumption that basically we can't do very much about this. If you suppress it too harshly, it will come back at some later point and overwhelm the NHS. So it's best to sort of manage it, and the term therefore is mitigation. Now, the important policy goal there is to protect the NHS from being overrun. This is, in my view, the real message of this slogan that you see Boris Johnson presiding over. Protect the NHS was the policy goal, and in a way he has achieved that, and that's why he has been speaking about apparent success. Of course, many more lives were lost than in comparable countries, but this was not the first policy goal. That would be my analysis of that. The second scenario there is to say, well, we have a high reproduction rate of infections, and this will be an exponential growth curve. So we should intervene as early as possible, trace every case with the goal of containment, and ultimately, Eva, eradication, I guess, is the policy goal. So there is a different, these two are different. At the moment, it's not clear what the government's strategy is, and nobody really presses them on that because they have introduced testing and tracing, but it's not clear for which purpose this is intended. So there is, of course, this is sort of black and white picture, but I think it illustrates how you can come to different conclusions depending on what information you select and what kind of assessment and judgment you make and what ultimate values you have. So if your values would be to save lives and protect the vulnerable, you wouldn't have sent people home from hospitals home or into care homes in order to protect the NHS and to have a sort of success story to tell in terms of numbers that the hospitals were not overrun. So just to speculate about what this tells us for our frameworks that I've been showing you at the beginning, I still think, well, there are some things we know, but there are several things we need to think carefully about and maybe think again. So if you think about civic epistemology in the UK, I think it's obvious that there is very little reliance on data. There is very much reliance on models on the other hand. We see something which we haven't seen before, which is the sort of rocking the boat, which is very much against normal UK procedures. We have a former chief scientific advisor who has set up his own independent SAGE, and that indicates that established ways of dealing with this is being stood on its head. So that's a novelty in terms of civic epistemology in the UK. And then there is this sort of the question of epistemological populism and appeal to common sense, gut feelings, etc. So we get on the occasion of discussing easing of the lockdown, you could see that there was a sort of awkward tension on the press briefing between Patrick Vallance and Boris Johnson, because Prime Minister said all 5 tests have been met, and the chief scientific advisor said the rate of infections is still very high, which indicated that he didn't think that all 5 tests had been met. So there is this kind of tension between a sort of science-based analysis of the situation, which looks at rate of infection, etc., and the sort of desire to please the crowd and go into a more populist direction, promising people that they can return to life rather sooner than later. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
That is fascinating and very, very helpful indeed. And now can we invite our final speaker, Andy Sterling from the Science Policy Research Unit at Sussex. And his presentation poses the question, what can STS approaches help society learn from this pandemic? And you're not using slides, I understand, Andy.
No, I've got a bit of a, if I get let loose with slides, I get carried away much too easily. So I figured I'd try and just speak to it on this occasion and see how that goes. But thanks so much for the invitation. It's really, it's been fascinating, the discussion so far. And I was asked to do this, I think, because of this blog post I did called Modernity Without Its Clothes, which tried in a slightly hypocritical way to try and explore some of the lessons of STS. I say hypocritical because one of the key points I think needed to be made, and it began with, is that there's really no shortage of chatter around media, academia generally. We've commented on this several times in this discussion about what the pandemic means, how we can pivot it, and no shortage also of self-assured commitments and expedient certainties coming to the fore in those kinds of discussions. It's another personality disorder I have. I make lists of things, and just it's incredible how many different topics: deglobalization, accelerating energy transitions, building resilience, reversing capitalism, you name it, the cause has been mentioned as a key issue for pivoting the pandemic, right down to rather more prosaic things: reimagining universities, reforming academic disciplines, improving the experience of doctoral research, for instance, all important issues. But it does seem, despite what is universally acknowledged to be the severity of the pandemic, no cause is too minor or too partisan for this platform. And there was I wading in exactly the same way, albeit with the caveat at the beginning, as I am now. But also I think in a gathering like this, and STS is notoriously self-critical to the point of asymptotically self-critical maybe sometimes, but and I owe more to STS than any other single discipline, but STS in particular I think has been a little bit prone, and it may be relevant to some of the questions we were asking in the last session, to salon-style discussions where the content, the language, even many of the aims are quite introspective. For instance, we can talk about this if anyone's interested, but areas like the Anthropocene, taking this fascinating bauble for the academic salon of the Anthropocene and discussing it as much as we do, I think we reflect too little on how much momentum we give to some pretty ominous forces out in the world for whom that imagination is incredibly useful. So this is a shame, I think, because much to the credit of STS, thanks also to many folk in this gathering, this network, that STS is, I do genuinely believe, uniquely well placed to point out some crucial things about this pandemic. And this is so despite the ambiguities and uncertainties, and indeed the countervailing certainties that we discussed before. So my own take was that STS provides a way that contemporary, the phrase I use, contemporary globalizing modernity, can understand itself better in the world, and how the understanding, this is a co-production point, and we can unpack some of this as well, but how the understandings of something are deeply shaped in the performance, the constituting, the enacting of those same things. And there are very serious implications, as the pandemic unusually reveals. So in particular then, in an effort to derive one of these possible lessons from that kind of standpoint, I tried to highlight the ways in which I think it's under-recognized even in STS, to which modernity, because we don't like these grand theoretic constructs, itself, despite its diversity globally, is founded constitutively on fictions and fallacies and fantasies of control. And what's important about the pandemic then is it's this experience, although the details do remain really radically open-ended, nonetheless it's clear, and clear to an unusual diversity of political perspectives, that these imaginations of control have been refuted. It's the emperor without clothes in the sense of the title I tried to use. The categories are not as fixed as language implies, has become really evident across wider media commentary, that numbers are not objective, that futures are not predictable, that science is apolitical has been refuted, that the research can reduce uncertainty rather than equally as often increase it. that policy can be based on evidence. That absolutely core trope has been massively destabilized, and that the outcomes that we may aim for can basically be controllable through all those means. These are classic organizing themes of STS over decades, and you find it now across editorials in mainstream newspapers. This is a massive opportunity, I think. And this chimes also with work I've been doing at the STEP Centre down in Sussex, exploring pathways to sustainability, where a lot of the literature on transformation, it's very fashionable now, transformation, transition, looks at these kind of, well, the largest middle range categories usually, the largest formations it looks at are capitalism, industrialism, technocracy. And by a kind of rather prosaic and pedestrian method, I just thought I would look at how modernity is imagined in social science, in the social sciences and humanities. The prosaic method was simply to go through a bunch of academic dictionaries, I think 36 of them, peer-reviewed dictionaries in some sense or other, just to look at what the constituting motifs are in the opinion of canonical social science and these other disciplines, geography, history, cultural studies, of modernity. And it's defined consistently, despite radical diversity of perspective, none of them overlapping. The themes that come to the fore are really quite striking. Individualism, rationalism, a scientific method, nation forming, democratization, bureaucratization, industrialization, growth of capitalism itself. Of course, we know the canonical sort of patriarchs usually, in fact, almost without exception, associated with those. But let's take them one by one and just think them through, because I haven't seen them, and I stand to be corrected on this, but I haven't seen work that shows how all of these really constitutively, in their core meanings, relate to control in some form, imagined control, individualization, imagined control of individuals over their lives, rationality, imagined as the means by which thought, reasonable, what constitutes reasonable thought is controlled for. Science is a means by which nature itself can be controlled very explicitly. Nations are the territories controlled by government. Democracy is a supposed control by the people of politics. Bureaucracy, the control of organizations. Industrialization, the control of production. Capitalism, the control of labor, etc., etc. So each one of these is really about an imagination control. It's like a metastasizing of these experiences of machines in modernity. And this is important because it is each of these kinds of imaginations of control that's really been so comprehensively refuted, and yet we're not really learning those lessons. And actually also crucial is the absence in these, when anyone can, it's one of the unusual in SGS, repeatability. I'll also probably go down in flames on this, but it's interesting how absent colonialism in specific forms are from definitions of modernity. And they are, of course, absolutely about control. So the idea of control is not because control is real in modernity, it's because pretense at control is a means by which to sustain contingent privilege. And so stories of control are a means to enact and sustain power, even if it's actually fictitious, one can still expect these. And so I think that goes a long way to helping explain some of the otherwise very poorly attended to messages from the pandemic. And also what's striking has been how frequent the critique in thinking that progressive or critical engagements are being made in relation to incumbent institutions dealing with the pandemic, being criticized through lack of control. So this feature of this pervasive theme of control is as prominent in incumbency or subaltern actually critiques of incumbency as is incumbency itself. So really, yeah, that's my little ding. I think I just heard it. So I'm just come to an end there. So what I came up with at the end was a series of, you could call them little STS homilies about the kinds of lessons we might draw from this, which aren't very precisely prescriptive, but I think that one can derive some quite pragmatic, concrete, substantive messages that we can turn to, and this is driving on work of many others, of course, humility rather than hubris about what is known, and in respect of each of the areas of the pandemic pathologies I mentioned earlier. Hope rather than fear about what is possible. Diversity rather than singularity about what is held to count in the world, mutualism, not hierarchy in organizing, equality, not superiority as driving values, precaution, not calculation in order to address the unknown, and flourishing rather than growth. And above all, in all these ways, it's about care. You could see these as constitutive, thinking of many strands of work in STS, of care rather than control. So although the implications of the pandemic are clearly radically open-ended, it has left modernity without its clothes, I think, in quite a profound sense. And this can be appreciated from an unusual wide range of political perspectives. So the STS experience resonates here in a way that we very rarely do so widely. And that's a way in which a message about the open-endedness of the futures that can be brought into being, the significance is not the end point is determined by STS, but the opportunity, I think, is really potentially profoundly underscored. So thanks for the invite.
You went over your time a little bit, Andrew, but it was so lovely hearing you produce such a positive view of our role. I couldn't bear to stop you. There's a little time for the discussion. That was really lovely. Thank you very much. And thank you all our speakers. Then we have a question from Kieran Flanagan for Rainer, which actually also then bears upon the role of STS, perhaps. And he asks, what about expertise about expertise? And can expertise about expertise have a different contribution to scientific expertise? And then this also then bears upon the role that SAGE and other experts are expected to play.
Yeah, well, not entirely sure how to read that. If it's sort of a second order expertise, that would be our job, because we are observing expertise as it's performed in decision-making contexts. But experts would usually be hired by a client and say, there's a lot of information here, can you make sense and can you help me out? What should I do? This would be the typical role of the expert. And as we have noted, very few people, if anyone, has come to us to say, can you help us out? So I guess this goes back to the point about how marginal are specific disciplines, or is it our own fault? Are we not shouting loud enough? Or does it have something to do with a kind of expertise that would be very difficult to digest? Because I guess it would, you know, would open up all these questions we've been discussing this afternoon, and people would say, you know, this is not really relevant. We want to know what the next step is in this saga, and you are not really very productive or positive, or, you know, whatever. So I guess this is, I didn't quite get the angle. If SAGE was assembling expertise, SAGE is sort of sifting through material, but does it provide expertise on expertise? I don't think so. It assembles knowledge and advises what to do with that. So they are the official expert body on that.
Andy?
Yeah, I think we probably need to be cautious, not in relation to what Rainer said, but in general, of Stockholm syndrome, or of being flattered or embarrassed into moves we might not otherwise make. And, you know, the idea that expertise about expertise is a motif that STS can trade under, I'm very, I mean, it's been well explored in very rigorous ways by Harry Collins and Rob Evans and others, but I'm really concerned about it. Steve Rayner has done great work in that area too, but I think it's a trap. If we're serious about the implications politically of co-production and about the way in which knowledge itself is imprinted by power, then claiming some meta role for expertise really doesn't get us out of the hook. We have the reason we are so marginalized, the good reason, apart from our salon-like behavior in STS, the good reason is that we're very threatening. It is very threatening to hold under various political interests, to hold a light up of the kind that STS does. And so we can expect to be marginalized for that reason, not be seduced into particular ways of engaging.
Can I just add to that? I don't think STS is monolithic in that. We too may agree on that, and maybe others, but there would be people who who would be keen to be part of other arrangements and say this is where we can show how useful STS is, and that's legitimate too. So I guess it's a broad church.
Greg has raised a question and says, taking into account Annie's previous point about pandemics being social phenomena, how seriously do the panelists take Dustin's point about ground zero empiricism? And then following Eva, does this risk foreclosing various potential knowledge bases? What are the political gains of accepting it? I don't know if either of you two feel.
Well, yeah, I'm not up to that task, but it's here we are. It's a great point. Again, I would be concerned about the idea in STS of thinking uncritically that pandemics are social. The point about STS is all phenomena are social phenomena because of the implications of co-production, because the way they are viewed contains the imprint of society in crucially formative ways. So in that sense, all phenomena are social phenomena. All of them are reproducing social orders to an important degree, and therefore there's a mandate across the board. And if we start saying in certain particular phenomena are social phenomena as well, then we're in danger of becoming confused about what I think is a distinctive message of STS.
Okay, I have a question from Angela Cassidy, lovely to hear from you, asking all the panelists to reflect on parallels and differences between entanglement and eradication as alternatives, between mitigation and containment, and whether these dichotomies help, and the implications for ideas or fantasies of control. And following on from that, how might we live with COVID? Okay, go on.
A lot of coffee today. Please stop me. But yeah, great question. Just very brief part of an answer. I'm sure there's many other points to make on it, but I'm cautious also about this aversion that STS particularly has to what it dubs dichotomies. We heard about, earlier, Ryan was talking about ideal types. And I think we shouldn't be apologetic about making distinctions. And we make distinctions if we do so rigorously one by one, and each one can be held up as being a dichotomy. But actually, when we do many of these, as everyone has been doing in this discussion, then we're not dichotomizing in ways that sometimes is a slightly lazy critique. We're looking at the polythetic nature of all these social categories and unpicking different distinctions, which then are in play together. So that's why I would defend against a concern about dichotomies in respect of that distinction.
Maybe just to add what Andy just said, I think from a pragmatist point of view, which is very much an STS perspective as well, it's not so much about demystifying binaries or dichotomies. It's more to show how they work. I mean, to show how dichotomies are used, binaries are used in order. I mean, whole modernity Andy was talking about works so well because it persuaded people that binaries work very well and they are used constantly. But this does not mean, obviously, to disrupt those discourses and show how things are entangled and to see how we may unfold imaginaries that go beyond those dichotomies or binaries. So just to go on an abstract way of demystifying binaries is not really an STS perspective, I would say. It's more showing how it works or it doesn't work.
Look, we've run out of time, and actually we've got at least a couple of hours more discussion to have. I have a shed load of other interesting posts, and there's no way that we can pose the questions, let alone answer them. So I think what we might try and do is to find some way of posting those and get some kind of online discussion to continue these very interesting contributions here. If I pick out one, it will be arbitrary and unhelpful. So can I thank our 5 speakers for really stimulating contributions, and thank the other people coming in line with their questions and thoughtful comments. So we're going to produce a report of this activity, which will include all the posts, as I said earlier, and hopefully we'll find some way of flagging this more generally. We've had 54 people and the 5 panelists, so 60 people today, so quite an effective event. I'd like to thank members of the AsSIST Executive Committee for all their hard work in putting this program together. I'd particularly like to thank Andrew Webster and Barbara Ribeiro for building the program and setting up the infrastructure, and also Matjas Vidmar for helping keep the machine running and facilitating the question and answer. If people aren't already members of AsSIST-UK, can we suggest now's the time to join, because the organisation is growing and coming to serve an increasingly important intellectual and organisational role in our community. So we're very pleased to have new members. But can I close by thanking our presenters for really, really interesting talks, and we'll be putting these up, presentations up online and putting a formal record into the public domain. So I don't know if there's I don't think there is an applause button, but I will applaud, and there are 50 people outside. You can hear, it's a little bit like Premiership football. You can be assured the crowds are clapping their enthusiastic appreciation of your contribution. So thanks, and it's been great seeing you all today, let's hope we can continue this debate. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.